The Ukrainian armed forces continue to burn Russian lines on many fronts of the war, especially on the Eastern Front. The Ukrainian armed forces are responding in the strongest way to the attacks carried out by the invading Russian army. However, on the Southern Front, the situation seems much more complicated for the Russian army. Crimea, defined as the heart of the war, is regularly hit by attacks by the Ukrainian armed forces. The Ukrainian armed forces continue to keep alive the possibility of a possible Crimean offensive, as it shatters many Russian targets in Crimea. As you may recall, a similar offensive operation was carried out in Kherson, and after months of hitting Russian targets in Kherson, the Ukrainian armed forces took action. At that time, the soldiers of Kiev who started the Kharkiv offensive distracted the Russian army and started a ground operation in Kherson, destroying the tired Russian lines. A similar strategy seems to be applied for the Crimea as well. On the other hand, given the strategic location of Crimea for Russian shipments and the Russian army in Ukraine, another reason behind the attacks is to increase the fear in the hearts of Russian soldiers by hitting the most reliable area of the invading Russian army. This war philosophy implemented by Ukraine also finds its way on the front lines. 2 more explosions occurred in Sevastopol, Russia's most strategic and important region in Crimea, immediately after the 36-hour temporary ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia. Explosions thundered again in the Crimea at 3 a.m. In the report published by Russian news sources, air defense systems deployed in the Sevastopol region noted that an unidentified unmanned aerial vehicle approached the city tonight. It was stated that after the target was determined, the drone was fired upon. It is stated that there is talk of a rather large unmanned aerial vehicle attacking unknown targets belonging to the Russian army in the Crimea. Local residents reported at least 2 explosions, but 1 drone was shot down, according to Sevastopol's Russian-backed governor. According to local residents, a rather large drone, possibly filled with explosives, appeared in the skies of Crimea. An attack on the peninsula and Russian air defense systems were activated, but UAVs could not be intercepted. Russia claims that the Russian air defense system managed to shoot down a drone over Sevastopol's North Pier. The source of the second explosion has not been fully disclosed, and it is known that it cannot be prevented. However, it is stated that this explosion was carried out by Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles. So far, there has been no official statement on this issue from the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation. The occurrence of these explosions actually shows us how helpless the Russian army was in the defense part. Crimea has been targeted at least 5 more times this year. After December 26th, this midnight drone army attack is recorded as 7 attacks. Crimea has been repeatedly targeted after the Moskva flagship was sunk by Ukrainian Neptune anti-ship missiles in April. The attacks on the Russian Navy in Sevastopol, Crimea, in August and November were colossal. Ukrainian drone armies were able to break through the Russian defenses and blow up the port of Crimea. While Crimea was claimed to be the strongest side of the Russian Navy, it became their weakest point in the 11-month war thanks to the successful operations by Ukraine. It is certain that there is a very clear reason for these attacks. We all know that the main target of Ukraine is Crimea, the favorite of Russian President Vladimir Putin. From the first moment when the Ukrainian armed forces gained the upper hand, Kiev has set its sights on the Crimean Peninsula. The recapture of the island, which was annexed by Russia in 2014 by the Ukrainian armed forces, seems almost impossible for now, considering the Armyansk bottleneck. But the Ukrainian armed forces seem to have a new plan in mind. Echoes of this plan resound in the Kremlin. Putin's fears about Crimea are increasing after the latest intelligence reports reached the Kremlin on this issue, because the vulnerability of Crimea is a reality. The fact that Crimea has been subjected to more than 10 attacks, both from the air and from the sea, in the last month, shows not only the Kremlin, but also us, how inadequate the defense systems in the region are. For this reason, the Russian army is preparing multi-pronged defense lines in the Crimea against the strong offensive of Ukraine, and at the same time, it is starting to evacuate many of the civilian Russians in the region. More than 1 million Russians are known to live in Crimea, many of them civilians. Currently, civilians are being evacuated periodically and regularly, while the number of Russian soldiers in Crimea is on the increase. Clashes will flare up in Crimea very soon, and the population of the peninsula is aware of this and is fleeing quickly. Russian military commanders are also increasingly concerned about Crimea's vulnerability to Ukrainian attacks. Fears are forcing Putin's general to make a significant change in their bombing campaign against Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. But for many Ukrainians, only the recapture of Crimea could bring a real end to the 8-year-old military conflict with Russia. Polls show that the vast majority see this as the only acceptable victory in this war. For the Russians, the 2014 annexation corrected a historic wrong done to them at the end of the Cold War, and the peninsula took on an almost mythical significance. Now, losing it in a war to gain territory would be a monumental humiliation for the Kremlin. The political interests of the war could not be higher. The risk is high for the USA and its European allies as well, that the support given to the war effort of Ukraine will continue until the Russian occupation ends. So far this year, Ukraine has repeatedly surprised the world with the effectiveness of its military campaign and its Western allies by the determination and unanimity of support for this campaign. Despite all the doubts expressed earlier in the war, there is little daylight between the messages from Kiev and those from their Western supporters. Looking ahead, the Crimean issue may be the biggest obstacle to this partnership. Given that troop numbers have fluctuated significantly since the start of the war, and the war is probably some distance away, it is difficult to know exactly what kind of resistance the Ukrainians will face in Crimea. But we do know that the peninsula, which includes the historic home of Russia's Black Sea Fleet and